Afternoon, everybody. I'm going to start this webinar, but I think some people may still be joining, but it is just gone 12:30 and we want to make the most of the time that we've got. So first of all, just to say hello to everybody that's joined us. My name is Lucy Watson and I'm chair of the Patients Association, and I'm really excited to have been asked to chair this last session of our Patient Partnership Week with Making Families Count. And first of all, to say that the Patient Partnership Week has been just so exciting. It's been so exciting to see how many people have joined us to talk about patient partnership and what it means in different environments and settings. And today, this is an area that is close to my heart. I've always wanted to see how the NHS and health and care services can really improve how they work in partnership with patients and their families after a serious incident. And that's what Making Families Count are about. And we've got quite a few of them here today. I'm not going to introduce them all now because they'll introduce themselves as they come to talk to you and tell you about their story and what this means to them. And please do put lots of questions as they come as you have them into the Q&A, and we will use those to then have, inform our discussion and really want to answer that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Len Hodkin, who will introduce himself and then will tell us a little bit about Making Families Count and then tell us about his experience. So Len, over to you. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. So my name's Len Hodkin. I am one of the members of Making Families Count. Making Families Count was initially born, I suppose, about several years ago, and it was it brought a number of family members who suffered traumatic or complex bereavement, along with senior NHS investigators together. And although we all come from different backgrounds and different stories, what we shared was the same issues in navigating the NHS, navigating investigations, and we shared the same experiences that were all similar in terms of the challenges that we faced. So we've got Julian Hendy from 100 Families. We've got Frank Mullane for domestic homicide abuse. We had Stephen Habgood from the suicide side of stuff, and we were all brought together. And I think about 2 years ago now, we set up a non-profit charitable organisation where we go into NHS Trust and speak to professionals in the NHS and highlight our positive and negative experiences. For me, I'm a criminal defence solicitor. I'm one of the directors of Making Families Count and also a trustee for Julian Hendy's 100 Families charity. And how did I get here today? In 2011, my mother, Sally Hodkin, was murdered by a lady called Nicola Edgington, who'd killed her own mother 6 years previously. And she was released under a hospital order and was supposedly being monitored by the NHS or Mental Health Trust in the community. She was a stranger to my mum. It was a completely unprovoked attack in broad daylight, 8 o'clock in the morning, and she was stabbed and killed in the street. So naturally, we had a number of questions relating to her murder, what actually happened, who was looking after Nicola Edgington, who was responsible for her care, could anything have been done differently, what can be done to ensure this sort of thing doesn't happen again. All completely legitimate questions for a grieving family. And again, this is a message that we repeat time and time again. It's not about getting people sacked or putting someone's head on a stick. It's about improving practices and training to ensure that the same mistakes are not repeated. So for us, to give you a bit of background, it took 5 years to publish an independent report from the NHS. It took 8 years for us to get to an inquest. If you contrast that with the we were dealt with by the police. The police completed a criminal trial within a year, and the IPCC, as it was called then, completed their investigation in 6 months. What was challenging for us is that we didn't have much, if any, contact from the trust at all throughout the whole sort of 8-9 year process. We contrast that with how we were dealt with by the police. We were spoken to on the day by the lead investigating officer. We were given a family liaison officer on the same day. We were given clear guidelines from the police in terms of what they can do, what they can't do, what they can tell us, what they won't tell us. If they didn't know information, they would let us know later on in the day, or when they could tell us. Eventually, Nicola Edgington was convicted and sentenced to 37 years in custody, but that trial only dealt with the issue of effectively whether she was mad or bad, and still nothing from the trust. The jury found her responsible for murder, and as I say, she was sentenced to 37 years imprisonment. In the following years from the trial, my dad brought legal action and sued the trust. But again, the issue there wasn't about Nicola Edgington's care or what had happened or how she'd been looked after by the trust. It was effectively whether Mum had a right to life and whether the trust could have foreseen what had happened for the failings or the link between the trust failings and the killing. So still no contact from the trust or any sort of form of support from the trust at all. The trust eventually settled through their lawyers, and the same questions remain for us. As I say, it took 5 years for an independent report to be published. The people doing the independent report would always tell us that we shouldn't speak about the investigation or discuss it with anyone, which I always thought, and still to this day, when families are told that by the investigators, I still can't see why. It's not a criminal investigation. The report writers are supposed to be independent. So what's the risk? What's the issue? Our contact or lack of it from the trust only made us as a family more determined to get to the bottom of what happened. And I knew, being a solicitor, that the trust would have to disclose everything eventually, even things they didn't want to at an inquest, as long as it was sort of relevant to the circumstances surrounding the murder. So for us, the inquest was a really important issue. The inquest took place in 2018, 7 years after Mum was killed. I conducted the inquest myself. I've done criminal trials, parole hearings and stuff like that. So I thought, how hard can it be? So the inquest was really important for us. We'd already had the papers from the criminal trial. The police had provided us with everything in terms of copies, statements, exhibits, CCTV. We now had a 300-page independent report, which we could use to obtain further documents. And what I also got to do was to cross-examine the psychiatrist, the nurse, the social workers, and those responsible for Nicola Edgington in the community. And I cross-examined them at length in the witness box, and it was probably, well, it was thoroughly uncomfortable for them. The press the trust received was awful, and there was a clear reputational damage to the trust and the staff. And you only have to Google Sally Odkin inquest to see that. And it all could have been avoided 7 years earlier if there was any meaningful, positive engagement from the trust. No way my dad would have sued the trust. It couldn't have and wouldn't have brought Mum back. But he was angry, he was upset, and he was resentful. Why were they ignoring us? Why were they not engaging? What were they hiding, and why? We were given vast amounts of documents and transcripts at the inquest, all of which could and should have been shared and discussed a lot earlier. And it still puzzles me to this day why that didn't happen. Granted, these are difficult conversations, but we all have difficult conversations every day. my professional capacity, I have difficult conversations with clients and their families every single day. Your son, your husband, your nephews going to prison, looking at lengthy sentences because they've done terrible things, they've murdered or raped people, or they're not easy conversations. But one thing I've learned in 20 years of doing my job is that people appreciate honesty, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. Since doing that inquest, I've worked with a number of families through Julian Hendy's 100 Families charity. The majority all share the same experience with getting difficulties with getting information and liaison with the trusts. I conducted an inquest earlier on this year where a family, their nan had been murdered by the son. He was released after being sectioned back to the home address, and there were some issues concerning whether he should have been released and whether he was well enough. And the coroner during that case directed them to serve some witness statements that the trust lawyers tried to argue shouldn't be shared, despite these documents were fresh in the mind of the staff. They were statements they'd made at the time in relation to the incidents, and the trust had tried to argue that it wasn't fair on the staff for their comments to be disclosed and didn't promote a no blame culture that might lead people not to be honest in the future. And I would say that being honest is the bare minimum that you should be in these circumstances, is it not? And what struck me after the coroner said no, they've got to be disclosed to the family, and this in that case was 3 years after the event, it was at the bottom of the statement there was a paragraph signed by all of the witnesses and dated, which said, please sign the contents of your interview as they could be used in subsequent proceedings. So my point is, despite the duty of candour and various guidelines and guidance on sharing information and being open and transparent, it doesn't happen nearly as often as it should. When it doesn't happen, it has a profound negative effect on families and their day-to-day lives for years to come after the event. At every court hearing, every solicitor meeting, internal investigations, independent reports, coroner's inquest, birthdays, Christmases, anniversaries, never goes away. Everything comes back, and it's made far worse and prolonged by trusts' failure to engage, failure to share information, and failure to be honest. And this continues to happen for years and years and years. Staff at trusts move on, people change jobs and they leave, but the families always remain. Never underestimate the determination and resolve of a bereaved family. You, your organisations and your leaders can make a difference in these cases. And the difference it makes to a bereaved family is immeasurable. I think, as you'll probably see from my colleague Jan's presentation, which is coming up. So my advice to you, or my takeaway message today, would be do the right thing and always start from the basis of how would you like to be treated if it was you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Len. And before I move on, I just, did you ever get any answers from the trust about, how they had responded to you and your concerns about that? Did they ever?
Only in the inquest under cross-examination in front of a coroner. So no,
yes.
And I think I know 100% my dad wouldn't have sued the trust, and I wouldn't have even bothered doing the inquest if they'd have just engaged at the start. And because, I mean, we're not going to get them in a room and start tearing shreds off people and angry, horrible fat. I mean, we're reasonable in terms of I knew what would happen at the inquest, and I knew what I was allowed to ask and what I wasn't. And it didn't have to be in that format. If they'd have just sat down and gone through our concerns and stuff from the start, or provided the information we requested at the start, it could have and probably should have all been avoided.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we're going to have a discussion about that and about, as you've said, the impact for your family having to wait so long to get those answers and to hear those answers, and not to get a sense of openness and caring from a health and care organisation.
No.
Absolutely. So, and the other thing that we'll pick up later, I'm sure, in the discussion is what people really mean by duty of candour. Because actually, so often it's interpreted as just sending out a letter, and actually sending out the letter to say that something's happened or gone wrong and to apologise should just be the start of duty of candour. But let's move on, because we want to hear from everybody. So I'm going to turn now to Jan Sunman, who's a founding member of Making Families Count. And Jan, please introduce yourself and then tell us about your story. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name's Jan Sunman, and I'm a founding member, and I'm a former director of Making Families Count. I've been involved from quite early stages with Len when we started pulling Making Families Count together. I'm going to share with you today a very different experience from Len's. Mine was relating to my daughter, and it was in an acute hospital trust. Thank you very much for sharing these slides. So I first of all wanted to talk a little bit about the principles around engagement with families in patient safety incidents under the new patient safety investigation response framework. I think it's quite important to set the scene for where we are today, because my experience was several years ago and so was Len's, but this is what is happening now. And so the new framework talks about the importance of prioritising compassionate engagement with those affected by patient safety incidents. And I think it's fair to say that Len's experience was not particularly a compassionate response at all. It also talks about the anchored in the principles of openness, fair accountability, learning, and continuous improvement, with the aim of learning how to reduce risk and associated harm. So again, the focus is very much on what can we learn from this. It's not about vilifying people, it's about an opportunity to learn, to change things for the better, which I think for many families is what we're aiming to do. But it also cautions that overlooking the relational elements of a learning response can lead to a breakdown of trust between those involved. And that includes patients, families and healthcare staff and the organisation. And I think Len's experiences amply demonstrate that. Next slide, please. So I think one of the things that I want to explore is the kind of issues that I think families want to know about under this new framework, because it does raise a lot of questions, because things can be done differently. So there is an opportunity to work much more flexibly under the PSIRF now, so that people can do thematic reviews. The kind of thresholds around serious incident investigations have changed, so that sort of, if you like, more moderate incidents can be investigated as well. But also it means that not all avenues, or not all incidents will be investigated fully in the same way that they would have been under a serious incident investigation. So I think it's really important that families have some of their queries addressed. So they need to know what the purpose and the scope of the information gathering will be, because they may have a lot of thoughts and ideas about what they want to see included in the scope of an investigation. Families need to know whether their incident will be investigated fully or done in a thematic way, or whether they be signposted onto the complaint system, for example. So they need information about that. And they need to know how they can be involved as a patient or wider family and friends. They also need to know how they can be supported, and whether they can have an independent advocate, because this is an incredibly stressful process for most families, and there is a real risk of re-traumatizing families if this process is not handled well. And I think finally, people need to know, how do you balance a system-focused change with a compassionate approach that deals with me in a person-centered way? And I think fundamentally as well, people need to know, will anything really change as a result of my taking part in this process? Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you now about my experience with my daughter. This is my daughter, Katie. And as I say, we experienced a very compassionate approach to what happened to our daughter. And it made all the difference, I think, to how we dealt with the issues and how we progressed in the rest of our life afterwards as a result of how it was dealt with. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about kind of unintended outcomes from what happened to our daughter. My daughter was 15 at the time when she experienced serious harm in an acute trust after elective surgery on her bladder. My daughter had spina bifida and hydrocephalus, so she was actually paralysed from the lower chest down. She had moderate learning disabilities. She had a shunt that controlled the hydrocephalus that she had. And unfortunately, she developed sepsis and bladder ruptured as a result of the sepsis. She developed encephalitis, and that caused major problems. I wanted to emphasize as well that it was an operation that we'd planned very, very carefully with the surgeon and with a specialist nurse at the time. So it wasn't rushed into. My daughter and ourselves had been advised and spent time being counselled about the implications of this operation. The aim was to create a mini stoma using her appendix so that her bladder could be emptied with a catheter and avoided the need for problems that she'd had with an indwelling catheter before. So it was nobody's intention. It was definitely an unintended outcome for all of us that things went so very badly wrong. And my daughter had developed this terrible post-operative infection, and she was in and out of hospital for several weeks, but then eventually things came to a head when she collapsed, and she ended up having emergency surgery because of the bladder rupture. She'd lost 1.5 litres of infected urine into her abdomen. And as a result of that, my daughter, we'd experienced a number of problems in the run-up to this collapse and the sepsis. One of the issues that we experienced were issues around diagnostic overshadowing, because some of the nurses didn't recognise that her symptoms were actually unusual for her. They attributed it to her learning disability, when in fact her behaviours were radically different to what we would normally see from her. They thought that she complained a lot about pain and that was typical for her, when it was actually very untypical, given that she was paralysed from the lower chest down. Her awareness of pain was very limited as a result of that. There was a real lack of compassion, I felt, from the nurse in charge on the ward, particularly to not just to my daughter, but to other vulnerable patients as well. And often kind of putting down and a dismissal of concerns that both we and Katie were raising to him. There was also a failure to recognise our concerns that I'd particularly raised with the nurses a few days before my daughter's collapse, that I was worried about her skin colour. Her lips were blue, her face had an awful blue-grey colour, her fingertips were blue, she was very short of breath. She'd been vomiting and she'd had diarrhea, and they dismissed that, all those concerns. So next slide, please. What happened was that my daughter collapsed when my husband had arrived one day and found her in the room on her own, and he realised something was very, very wrong. He pressed the emergency button and they couldn't find a measurable blood pressure because it was too low. And she was then operated on, and unfortunately was only given a 10% chance of survival when she was admitted to intensive care that day. She was in intensive care in total for 3 months, and moved between 3 different intensive care units. with the problems of moving a very critically ill patient between units meant that she deteriorated each time, and she was in hospital for a total of 6 months. I now want to talk about the permanent impacts. Next slide, please. So, as a result of what happened, my daughter was left with brain damage because of the encephalitis. So she was left with severe rather than moderate learning disabilities. Her eyesight was affected, so she was left with kind of tunnel vision. She could only see in the centre of her vision. And that was just very distressing for her because she used to love drawing and art, and she couldn't see very well to do that anymore. She ended up with a permanent urostomy because they had to remove her bladder because of the rupture. She was in intensive care again at the age of 21, because they tried to correct some of the problems with the urostomy because it'd been done as an emergency, and as a result, time was of the essence. So it wasn't done perhaps as well as we would have liked. And so they tried to correct that at the age of 21, but again, further problems with sepsis, internal bleeding, and so on. And from then on, every 6 weeks, she was admitted to hospital for insertion of pigtail stents into her kidney ureters to keep her kidneys draining, basically. Without those, her kidneys would not have drained. And then, obviously, radically, her mental and physical health was very badly affected by what had happened. She became severely depressed and anxious. She became needle phobic, and she had increasingly chronic severe sepsis. So we were constantly in and out of hospital over the subsequent period of her life. And next slide, please. And sadly, she died from sepsis at the age of 25 as a result of what had happened. And I want to talk to you about the investigative process we experienced, though. So despite all these things that had gone so badly wrong, we were treated with such compassion. It made such a difference. So on the day of her collapse, when she was 15, the surgeon who normally looked after her had been on leave, but he was back after the weekend, and his first response was to turn up on the intensive care unit. And he spent a long time with us that morning, going through everything that had happened to her, wanting to know information about what we'd experienced, what we'd seen, how the staff interacted with us, and so on. And he agreed with us that he would use the Mortality and Morbidity Committee to investigate this internally, but he also sought external review from one of the top urologists in the UK. So he was really subjecting his work to intense scrutiny. He was very forensic in his detail about what he'd done, questioned with us very openly and honestly about the things that he'd done, whether he'd made the right decisions at the right time, and so on. And he, crucially for us, listened to us and showed huge respect, I think, to us as a family. There was one specific area we didn't agree on, and that was where a patient had spoken to us on the day my daughter was rushed off to intensive care, and said that she had seen that Katie had been extremely distressed that morning, and that nobody had gone to her to support her, and that she'd been in extreme pain. I personally felt that her response was accurate, because the first thing my daughter said when she regained some level of consciousness was, "Mum, I was in intense pain." And so she was commenting on the fact she was no longer in pain at that point. So I think her observation that my daughter had been in severe pain was accurate. He felt, however, that she wasn't a reliable witness, but I didn't know this patient. And he kept in touch regularly with calls and letters throughout the whole process, which was really important. So it wasn't just a one-off contact about the incident. He kept in touch with us throughout the whole of my daughter's journey through intensive care and out again. I wanted to just put up an extract from the letter that he sent to us. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you the opportunity to read that briefly, and just to comment on how that letter felt for us to receive that. So I think the first thing I would want to say about that letter was that he wanted to hear from us, although he was getting these medical reports, and he wanted to keep hearing from us how things were going, what was happening, what our experiences were. He was very clear about his responsibility to Katie and to us about what had happened. And I think the striking thing for us as well was that he didn't just see her medical issues, he saw the whole person. He he wanted to know about her emotional needs and her developmental response to what had happened. So he was looking at her very holistically. And he was also very clear that it had an impact on our family, and was very supportive of us in his comments. Next slide, please. So I think the crucial thing for us was that our trust in in the hospital, in what they did, and so on, was rebuilt because of his honesty and his willingness to share information about what had gone wrong. And so our trust was rebuilt and it was maintained. Unlike Len, we didn't feel the necessity to take legal action to get answers, although we had been advised by one nurse that we could have taken legal action. We chose not to do so because we felt that everybody had acted in good faith. Nobody wanted this to happen. What we all wanted out of it was to get answers about how things could be improved. It was far less traumatic for us as a result because of the interactions with the hospital staff. And also interestingly, the CQC rating at that hospital improved as a result of subsequent actions that they took. So I want to now just talk briefly about how they got it right for families as a result of that, and how I think it can be done for others too. So next slide, please. So one of the things that was striking about the way we were supported was that there was a whole family approach to us in the investigative process, and that the investigation valued the knowledge of the family and friends in gathering the information and using the information. As a result of what we identified with the surgeon, there was positive change identified with us. And there was very clear evidence of behavioural changes in the hospital staff and in the way that things were done. So, for example, there were 2 learning disability liaison nurses appointed by that hospital as a result of us sharing how we felt there'd been inadequate support and a lack of recognition of my daughter's needs as a learning disabled person. There was transformation in the awareness of sepsis and sort of early warning systems, if you like, were put in place. There was a definite change in the way that information was communicated with families and the community wider. Because one of the things they put in place was a system whereby if relatives were concerned that their relative was deteriorating very rapidly and seriously, there was a mobile number to the intensive care unit that put them through to a helpline there so that they could seek advice from the intensive care staff if they felt that their relative was deteriorating and that their needs were not being responded to. And I gather that system has been adopted at other hospitals subsequently. And I think it created a just culture for all involved in that. We didn't want the surgeon's head on a plate, as Len said. What we just wanted was to learn what had happened and to ensure that things like this did not happen to other people again. And I think that was the outcome for us. So thank you for listening.
Jan, thank you so much for telling us about your experience, and such a contrast to Len's, and everything that all those points that you make, that you didn't want to need to take legal action because you had the answers and you were supported and you did see the changes being made. And that's just so important. And the bit I really liked in one of your slides was saying candor in action. I do think there's a real message that everyone's got hooked into, I think, in the health service, sort of duty of candor and ticking the box that they've sent this letter out. And in my view, that's, as I said earlier, that's just the start. And what you've described from your experience really is candor in action, isn't it? Thank you. So now I'm going to move us on to I'm sure we're going to come back to Jan's story, and there's so much learning for how to get things right from that. But now we're going to hear from Dorrit Braun, and Dorrit is going to tell us about her experience when things went wrong for her family and how that worked. So Dorrit, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everyone. I think it's by now afternoon or good lunchtime anyway. I'm going to talk to you about the experience that we had of trying to be prepared for the serious incident review meeting following the death of my daughter-in-law. And there she is on her wedding day, Mariana Pinto. And to explain what happened, and I'm afraid it's yet another very traumatic story, I'm going to read you the coroner's narrative verdict because it's the most objective, quick summary that I can find, really. So the coroner said as follows: Mariana Pinto died on Sunday, the 16th of October, 2016, when she stepped over the balcony of her home, fell from the 3rd floor, and after some minutes rolled off the glass roof on which she'd landed to the ground below. Her actions were deliberate, but she did not have the understanding necessary to categorise these as suicide. She was in a confused state with features of psychosis. This was a consequence of cannabis withdrawal and the unmasking of an underlying anxiety by the cannabis cessation. Or at least that's what the psychiatrist said at the inquests. They withdrew that later on as part of the legal process. Following an uncharacteristic and florid episode, Ms. Pinto had undergone a Mental Health Act assessment in hospital the day before her death. After treatment with lorazepam, she was discharged. She was assessed as not detainable. She did not want to be admitted as a voluntary patient and so was discharged with medication and an arrangement for the crisis resolution and home treatment team, the crisis team, to visit the following day between 5 and 7. We didn't understand that those are the visiting hours. At 3:32 on the day of her death, Ms. Pinto's husband rang the crisis line asking for help on an urgent basis because his wife was deteriorating rapidly. The home visit was not brought forward. He was advised to call the police, but no call was made by the crisis team to the police or ambulance service to confirm he'd been able to call them and that help was on its way. The police and ambulance services were not called to attend. At 4 p.m, Mariana Pinto broke away from her husband and jumped. So I've been asked to talk about how on earth in that kind of circumstance one prepares for a serious incident review meeting. And I think it's probably quite important to bear in mind, and there may be people in the room now who are in similar situations, that actually the notion that you can prepare as a family adequately in the immediate aftermath of this degree of trauma is optimistic. So I think what you need to do is you need to rally the troops, as it were, your friends, your relatives, and any other agencies that you can find who might help. In our case, we managed to find AVMA, which is Action Against Medical Negligence. And I think that's where it's worth me kind of backtracking a bit and saying a little bit about me. So I'm now retired, well, kind of. At least I do unpaid work. I suppose that's different. And I was in the run-up to retirement when Mariana died, but most of my career had been spent in the voluntary sector. And therefore I knew that there would be a charity, because there's always a charity. So I knew to ask my friends and my acquaintances and ask them to ask all of their friends and acquaintances who could help us, because we can't do this on our own. And we found AVMA, Action Against Medical Accidents, and we rang AVMA. And I think without their help and advice, we'd have been utterly lost. Can I have the next slide, please? So the first thing that AVMA said is that they thought it was negligent. And they recommended that we got legal advice, and they recommended that for 2 reasons. Not because we wanted compensation, not even because we wanted anybody's head on a plate, but because the trust, or in our case 2 trusts, A&E and the Mental Health Trust, would have their own lawyers, but we as a family at the inquest would be completely unrepresented. And we had a lot of questions that we wanted answered. So the recommendation was, see if you can get a lawyer. You might find that someone will take you on a no-win, no-fee basis, which they did. We couldn't have afforded it. You don't get legal aid for inquests, which is a bit of a bummer. So we did choose a solicitor who advised us, and that was one of the reasons we chose her, that we should try our very best to collaborate with the trust, to start with the assumption that they would want to work with us, that they would want to learn, and they would be as keen as we were to understand what went wrong and how they could learn from it. So that's how we went into the serious incident review meeting. But we also asked a friend to accompany us, because I didn't know if I could keep it together. My son certainly couldn't keep it together. And so we felt like it would be helpful to have someone who could be a little bit more objective and just not fall apart in seeking information and trying to get answers about what they were going to be looking at. And because we'd asked a friend to help us, she was able to help us think about, well, what did we want to get out of this meeting? But so did the solicitor. So we got two lots of advice. What is it you're hoping to get out of the meeting? What are the questions that you want answered? And where would you like to meet? So they did offer to come to our home, and that's what we opted for. And it's quite important, if anybody listening is in this situation, to think about where you want to meet, because for some of you, you might feel like your home is a place that you don't want someone from the trust entering. But I felt that going to any of the trust premises was, and I did subsequently go and meet people at the trust, and it felt like I was going to the scene of a crime. And I know that's illogical, but you know, we're very emotional creatures. That's how it felt. So you might want, maybe the friend could offer their place, or you can find some neutral venue, a hotel lobby, whatever, if you don't want them to come to your home. In our case, we did, and we had a photo, the photo you've just seen, enlarged, which was on the mantelpiece. So the serious incident reviewer saw a photo of Mariana looking happy on her wedding day as he sat and talked with us. And that was quite intentional. We wanted it to be about her, not about him, not about the trust, not even about us, about her and what happened and what could have been done differently. Next slide, please. So if it's possible, at the beginning of the meeting, you should try to explain that these are the questions you'd like answered. Now, we got a bit stuck with that in our case, because the serious incident reviewer was not terribly receptive to our questions. He was more interested in trying to manage our expectations. And we got in quite a muddle about the advice to ring the police, because what nobody had grasped was that the evening before, when Mariana was discharged, we'd been given a little card with a phone number of the crisis team, and it said that they were available 24/7. And this was the number to ring. And we were told we'd been referred to them. So in our heads, we were in the system. That was point number one. Point number two was that the previous day, when my son had asked me to ring 999 because he couldn't, because he was holding her, trying to restrain her from running out into the street barefoot and very, very distressed. We had rung 999, they turned up, they had to get additional help. In the end, there were 4 police officers and she'd had to be handcuffed to get her to hospital. So my son was not very keen on ringing 999 again, given that how distressing that had been for her. And of course, nobody had explained to him that psychosis is dangerous. Nobody had explained that to any of us. We had no idea what she might be capable of or what might be happening to her. It was a first episode. She'd never done this before. So we suggest also that you take notes and ask your friend to take notes. And that you ask for a copy of the notes that the person takes. We never got that from the serious incident reviewer. The cost to the trust, and this is a bit like Len's story really, is if you start treating people badly and trying to manage them in the way that he tried to manage us. You lose trust, and we start to think you're hiding something. And the more we think you're hiding something, the more we badger, and it becomes far more work for you. And then if you don't answer the questions thoroughly, you end up with a complaint on your hands on top of everything else. So, which they did. It wasn't negligent, and it's probably quite important that you know it wasn't negligent, because that means it's going to be much harder for people to get a solicitor in future circumstances on a no-win, no-fee. This was the kind of response that you can expect on a busy A&E ward from a psychiatric liaison team on a Saturday. One of the things they didn't do, and we asked about this endlessly, is they didn't see my son separately. Now, he was bruised and bitten. It was completely uncharacteristic and terribly distressing, but they didn't think to see him separately. And we inquired endlessly. That's not negligent, but they did think it was poor practice. We think so too. We hope they've learned from it. But we have no guarantees that they've learned from it, because they don't stay in contact with us and we don't get any feedback. Ask for a contact email address and a phone number. Now, we got those. I feel that the serious incident reviewer perhaps regretted it, because the less he answered the questions, the more I emailed him. And he no longer works for the trust. 2 years after Mariana died, I'm interested in what Lucy says about the duty of candour. We never got an apology. We never had a sorry at the time. 2 years later, when we were still going through the complaint, we were contacted by the new chief medical officer, who arranged to visit us and offered an apology and said his predecessor had a different understanding of the duty of candour. We never got a letter. We've never ever had an apology in writing from that trust. We never had in writing what the serious incident review process was, why it was, how long it was going to take. Nothing. We did ask what would be the outcome of the meeting and when would we get a report, or what would the outcome be? Well, it would be a report, and we were given a date. Obviously, the date was a fiction. I say obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but the trouble is, when you're undergoing this degree of trauma, people like me hold on to dates as little milestones that you kind of cling to as you go down this ghastly road that you've never travelled on before. So you think, on such and such a date, we're going to get this. But then you don't. And you don't even have an email. You have nothing. So then you email the man, and 2 days later he says, oh no, sorry, there's been a delay. Well, when will we get it? Well, I don't know. We learned not to take any deadline from that trust seriously, ever, because it was too painful to believe in the deadlines. Whereas with the coroner, because the serious incident report, of course, goes to the coroner, as did, all the other statements, we were given the date that the information would be disclosed to us, and it was delayed, but her assistant contacted us immediately and said, it's going to be a day late. We're really sorry. It's taking her longer to read it than she anticipated, but be assured she's reading it really closely. And that was fine. We could wait another day because we understood and someone had bothered to tell us. So these are all the things you can do to prepare, but they might not work. And that's why I think, going back to where I started, have a friend with you. Don't try and do this by yourself. In Len's case, Len is a trained and very experienced solicitor, but most of us aren't. And although I'm eloquent and intelligent and, I've done high-powered jobs, the idea that I could have faced people in an inquest was just laughable. There's no way I could have done it. There's absolutely no way I could have done it. And I don't know what I would have done if we had not been eligible for a no-win, no-fee lawyer. So thank you all for listening, and I hope that's been of some value. Thank you.
Dorrit, thank you so much. And, and thank you to everybody for being prepared to tell us your stories and go through them again, because I'm sure you've told them so many times. But hopefully this is a more supportive environment. But you've made a number of really important points there, I think, and that what I'm going to phrase as in a way what Jan talked about as well was independent advocacy, you know, through that, getting that legal advice, and also through having a friend to go with you, and the importance of that, and the challenges really of securing that it was down to you to find that, and that's often the case, and that's certainly not how it should be, because as you've set out really clearly, this is a really complex process that you have no idea about. So it must have been so difficult, and at a time when you're already so traumatized and upset. We're going to come back to all of this. We'll come back to the discussion around, you know, what could be better, and you know, how could, because you've all started to talk about how it could be better, and there's so much to learn from your stories. But I'm just going to come to our last speaker from Making Families Count, who is Jan Fowler. And Jan, I will leave you to introduce yourself as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Lucy. So yes, I'm Jan Fowler. I'm the director of Making Families Count, and recently retired director. I'm a nurse by background, but director, chief exec, director of nursing roles that I've held in the NHS for 40 years. So I do come at this from a different experience, and I suppose that ties in with how Making Families Count is constructed. As Len explained at the beginning, we are predominantly families who have their own lived experience, with some senior NHS staff as well, or ex-staff as well. And I'm going to come to this from that perspective, really. So this is Making Families Count's aim. We're seeking to improve outcomes for families affected by serious harm or traumatic bereavement in health and social care services. And I wanted to try and pose, I suppose, try and answer two questions. So the first is sort of, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference for NHS staff to listen to the sort of experiences that you've listened to this afternoon? Does it really make a difference, or is it just something that, you know, they listen to and then move on? And what are some of the issues within healthcare professionals in those sort of situations? And I'm not sure I can answer them totally, but I'll give it a go. So if we go to the next slide. So these are some of the comments that people who've attended our webinars, our training, been involved with us, have left. And I suppose the thing that strikes me is that all of these comments are they're a bit action orientated. Mm. So, you know, left me wanting to do better, you know, call to action, left a lasting impact, made me think differently about working with families. And I think that's, I mean, certainly for me, you know, over 40 years, I've attended quite a lot of training. And the things that I can still remember are things where there's been that human contact, where you've got some emotional connection, if you like. You know, Dorit said it, you know, we are emotional beings, so we connect more when we can actually really understand what this is like. You know, we might read loads of cases, we might read loads of reports, but actually listening to somebody tell their story is really quite powerful. And I'm sure, you know, you felt that in listening to Len and Jan and Dorit this afternoon. So if we go to the next slide. Because what we're trying to do is share that lived experience. And it's not out with policy or process or the theory, but it's a way of actually demonstrating what all of that means to a family. I think every speaker so far has said it, so I need to say it as well. We're not about trying to get people's heads on sticks or plates, whichever you want to use, but it is actually just making sure that people can actually see what the impact of sometimes small things, just language or casual terms that they've used, or even, you know, Dorit said she actually did get offered the option for somebody to come and visit her rather than being dragged back into the hospital. But quite often people don't. Quite often families are just expected to, you know, come to us, come to the hospital, which may have been where the incident happened, may have been where their family member died. And it's not intended to hurt anybody, but it's just, you know, so casual that we just don't think about what that might feel like. So we go to the next slide. So I think part of what we try to do, and we do work collaboratively with the NHS, you know, this is not about, we're not a campaign organisation or an organisation that's trying to get at the NHS. It's that blend of people who both work for the NHS and families who've been affected in this way. But trying to demonstrate ways in which the benefits of positive family engagement can be derived. So if you do it well, it's not just the family that benefits, it's actually the NHS that benefits as well, staff that benefits as well. So recognising that, you know, families have significant informations about their loved ones, obviously, but if you're doing an investigation, you're likely only to be looking at a very narrow part of the care that that person's received. The family will have probably observed the whole of that care pathway. They will have a whole raft of information that could impact on the investigation that you're doing. So to try and do an investigation without involving them and engaging them effectively just sort of feels like you're trying to do it with one hand tied behind the back. They can raise basic questions, which is not, you know, it's not trying to sort of raise the importance of the questions that they're asking, but actually sometimes if you do this on a more regular basis, or you come to it with a certain perception, a certain sort of level of assumption almost, and actually it's really helpful to be sort of taken back to, so what's the basic issues that we need to understand here and need to address? And the families can help do that, because they will ask the very basic questions, which if you don't answer them, you will create a very different perspective for the investigation as a whole. We've heard a little bit about, you know, humanising what happens, and I think it can humanise what happens which is a very powerful way in which to learn. We talk in the NHS about doing investigations because we want to learn, but actually if we write reports which talk about patient A or Mrs. C, then that's not about a person, that's about a case. So actually having something which understands what the whole investigation report is about, the person that it's about, can be really quite powerful. And that can be about, it can be about language, but, you know, we suggest to people that actually they should ask the family for a sort of pen portrait or a photograph. I think, you know, the point that Dorrit made is really important, that actually you need to be able to see who this is that we're talking about. And actually it helps manage negative media attention and reputation. Hospitals are sometimes more concerned about reputation than other issues, but in some ways, not to say that reputation isn't important. Of course it is. If I'm going into my local hospital for treatment, I want to, you know, feel that that hospital's got a good reputation. But actually failing to effectively involve families perpetuates their need for, and their feeling that their voice is not being heard. If you're not listening to somebody, then they may well go somewhere else to talk about what's happened to them. So actually it's not a terribly clever thing to do, to ignore people if what your intention is to manage reputation. And I think all of our stories today have demonstrated that actually not engaging well with families can result in re-traumatizing them. And it is just simply the right thing to do. It's the thing that everybody, if they were in this situation, would expect to happen. You know, I've worked in the NHS a long time. I would expect this to happen. And sometimes it's quite shocking to hear of instances where actually it's quite the opposite. And if I can go to the next slide. So, you know, there are issues about understand. So why doesn't this happen? You know, there are, I don't think there is anybody, there are people in the NHS who work in that setting because they want to do good, they want to provide benefit. So that's completely the opposite to the sorts of things that we've heard today. So it's what we're trying to do is working with the NHS staff to understand what are the barriers to them working in a more positive engagement way with families. And a lot of what we hear is fear of blame. So people who think, you know, somehow the blame is going to land personally on their shoulders. And there is a real issue about feeling like, you know, you're going to be hung out to dry, you're going to be the one who's going to be blamed for this. That obviously will drive any openness or transparency underground. Confidentiality and sharing information, that seems to be a particular issue in mental health. So people not being quite sure how much information they can share with families, how much they need to maintain confidentiality. I think some of what Dorrit's story relates to that, where people are not really sharing information or making sure they've got a whole picture before they're making decisions. We actually run a whole seminar on this because it's such a difficult issue for people to get their heads around in sort of real-time situations. And managing a family's anger and distress and grief. And yeah, we all know when we're in a sort of, when we're not in a direct confrontational sort of feeling situation, that actually part of grief is anger and distress. But when you're sat in front of a family that's shouting at you, that's quite difficult not to react. So knowing, and we often don't provide the right sort of support or training or even time for staff to do this well. Quite often, I mean, I've had that experience of going to meet with a family, and you're trying to fit it in between whatever clinic or ward duties you're undertaking that day, and that when you go back you've got a whole other stuff. So it doesn't really set up the right sort of environment for being able to really be supportive and present with that family trying to deal with what is the most awful situation for them. There are very definitely issues about organisational culture, I think. It's all very well as having the strap lines and the policies in place, but actually if staff don't believe that that's what's going to happen, or they see things that are at odds with that, then then they're not going to be encouraged to be open and transparent with families. Difficult conversations, again, that goes back to sort of training and support for people. So how do they approach those conversations? How do they make sure that they are answering the questions that they're being asked, rather than trying to manage somebody's expectations? And then there's a whole issue about legal advice and misconceptions about legal status. It's a complicated environment, so this may not be the only investigation that's going on around this for this family. You might be doing an investigation, there might be a safeguarding element, so there's something else going on over here. There's an inquest, so there's something else going on over here. There's a police investigation, so there's something else going on over here. And trying to mesh that together, sometimes it's obviously incredibly difficult for the family. It's also sometimes quite difficult and can lead to various misconceptions in terms of the trust, in terms of what they should or shouldn't give with regard to information. So I think there's a number, and there's probably, that's not a definitive list, there's probably a whole range of other things. But I think what Making Family Count tries to do is work with the NHS so we can all talk about those things and understand what are some of those barriers. Because actually, if we go back to the mission statement or the stated aim for Making Family Count, what we're trying to do is ensure that future families have a much better experience than the ones that our member families have. So I'll end it there because I know we want to leave plenty of time for questions. But thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to all of our staff from our presenters from Making Families Count today, and we hope that this has been a helpful afternoon, and we look forward to discussion now.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you so much for bringing that other perspective of, why is it that health professionals and NHS organisations sometimes find it so difficult to respond. And actually, it made me think again around Jan's story about how open and honest their clinician was, and the letter that you showed, that except the letter. I mean, what a wonderful letter to receive. And he must have had, or he or she must have had tremendous courage to feel able to do that, given the atmosphere that there can often be, and the context that there can often be, and the difficulties. I'm interested in, just as a start, actually before, I just want to say that we've got several comments in the Q&A, particularly from Richard telling us about his very similar experience and thanking you for sharing your experiences, and Amy also saying the same, but saying she doesn't feel able to share as Richard has done about his experience because it's still too difficult. And those are really good examples for us all of just, as with your stories, of just the level of additional harm that happens to people when you're not listened to, and not treated with compassion. But I just wanted to start with, because Len talked about the family liaison from the police and how much better the police did all this and seemed to understand about that. And then, you know, Dorrit, you've talked about getting that, you know, independence and help to help you through this process. I'm just interested in, is that how the NHS should learn from that? You know, is it about having independence right outside of the NHS, or is it about having family liaison, you know, along the lines that the police have done that, are properly trained and supported, or is it a mixture of the two? I just wondered what your thoughts are around, you know, what families really need to help them through this time, and how do they access it? Don't know who wants to start. Len's going to have a go first, and then we perhaps to Dorrit and Jan.
Yeah, I think the main difference with, I mean, don't get me wrong, I mean, I deal with plenty of families that don't like the police or don't like the family liaison officers, but I think what is important to distinguish and sort of get right is that the police officers who are the family liaison officers are still police officers. Their primary role is still investigating and being a police officer. They just happen to have the fortunate or unfortunate task, depends on how they see it, of looking after and liaising with that family. And I think how they got it right with us and with a lot of families that I see is that they're allocated to family liaison officers on the day, a couple of hours after the particular incident. They're given to you by the senior investigating officer. So straight away you feel that it's important, your case is important. It's important to your family, because there's a senior officer who's in charge of the investigation that says, look, you probably won't see me again, or if you do, it'll be few and far between. But here's your family liaison. They dual deploy, so that if you can't get hold of one, there's another one. They'll look after all your needs and stuff. They set out clear guidance and boundaries of what they can and can't tell you, and if they can't tell you why, and at a later date they might be able to tell you that information. And I think most people get that in a criminal investigation that might be scuppered by you going to the press with certain information, stuff like that. I just don't feel that you get the same sort of service from the NHS, in terms of everyone's just too frightened to say anything or give you information that they might not be allowed to tell you, when I think it needs to be looked at from a different sort of perspective. And we talk about a lot when we're out about what information you can share, rather than saying what information you can't, or looking at it from the basis of, well, why can't I share that? They look at it like I shouldn't share that, or I'm not allowed to share that, where you should be asking what information can I share and why. And for me, a lot of these cases, whether it's mental health, homicides, suicides, whatever, when it comes into these sort of serious investigations, if there's an inquest at the end of it, or likely to be, all this information is going to come out, right? So why delay it? Why frustrate, annoy, traumatize a family even more, when you know at a year, 2, 3 years down the line, everything that you've got is going to be shared at an inquest? Why could it not be shared? Because I think it negates people getting the ump and suing the NHS. It negates relationships breaking down, and the trust completely, like, between the parties going. And I think that it like in Jan's experience, just someone talking to you, someone letting you know what's gone on. It might not even been anything bad that's gone on, but just that communication to start with, and being open and honest to start with, goes a long way, because people do get the ump and people do get suspicious when you're coming up against barriers all the time. I mean, that would be it from me.
Thank you, and that's really helpful, Len. And the other thing you brought in there was that bit about having contact with somebody senior, which I think is often missing for people. Someone you can escalate to if you're not getting the answers you need, or you're not being told what you need to do. And this, before I come to Dorrit to just answer that at this point, there are various comments in the trust, and Richard in the Q&A, and Richard is saying that, you know, that the police family liaison model isn't the be all and end all. And not everybody has good experiences with the police, which I'm I'm sure is true. I think what I was really asking is, you know, is there a model that could be developed in that way or not? But I'm interested to just come to Dorrit and get your sense, because you talked about this very much in your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I know some trusts, one of the things that the new medical director was banging on about to me as in an attempt to reassure me was that they were going to employ a family liaison officer. And my response to him was, well, if the trust isn't going to change its behaviour and its attitudes, then one person on their own is not going to make a difference. And it reminds me of the debate in the 80s when I used to do quite a lot of work with schools around involving parents. And a lot of schools would have a parent involvement coordinator of some description. They were a homeschool liaison worker, you know, they had various titles. And where the head and the staff believed in parental involvement, that person was really helpful because it was an extra pair of hands. And someone to do a lot of the legwork. But where the head and the staff didn't believe in it, that person was absolutely useless and had a miserable job. So, you know, it depends on it's the organisational culture, I'm afraid. It has to want to be a learning culture and one that's interested in what could we do better. And some are and some aren't.
Thank you. And I think that's so true. Just whether the organisation really wants to engage with you and listen to you. And I thought what was really interesting in what you said, Dorrit, was how the investigator who came out actually wanted to manage the conversation. So he came with his own agenda. And that's such a crucial thing, whether it's about whether it's a complaint or it's an investigation or whatever it is, or even just somebody coming to do an assessment, that if people come with their own agenda rather than listening to you and what matters to you and what you've seen, you're going to start, you're not going to get the answers that you want, and that's come through so clearly.
I think that's right. And there's a really important point about the things that the family know. And it's such a small issue in our case compared to everything else. But one of the things that the A&E consultant picked up from me was that although they had provided food and drink for Mariana in the cubicle while we were waiting for the assessment, she had spat it out because she thought it was poisoned. And there was not one of the clinical staff from either trust who noticed that. And yet there were bits of sandwich, you know, all over the cubicle. The police noticed and we noticed, but nobody even got that information from us, you know, at the time or afterwards. And we kept saying, but we know things because we were there the whole time. So, and she said to me, she's never forgotten it. We provide food and drink and then we think fed and watered. Not necessarily.
I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you, Dorrit. I think that's absolutely right. And that's also, you know, those things that the families have seen, the families have witnessed, and that busy staff may not have witnessed, which is so crucial. And Jan talked about that earlier in terms of, you know, what was normal for her daughter in terms of experiencing pain. Now, we have got a few more questions, and Brian Finney has got a question for Jan, particularly saying that would a central unit in NHS England at a regional level be able to gain the expertise that are needed to address the barriers, rather than the trusts having to do that? So would it be sensible to set up a separate unit to do all of this, to develop the expertise so that the trust could just get on with the day job?
So personally, I generally don't think that would be a good idea, except perhaps in more specific cases where, you know, there can be situations where actually the families have completely lost trust in the organisation, and therefore, you know, I think probably your only way to get an investigation that you can have any confidence in is for some independent body to do it. But in the main, I think what's important to a family, and what people often say, not often, frequently say, is they don't want this to happen to anybody else. So that has to mean that there's got to be some learning, and that learning needs to take place at where the incident took place itself. So, you know, if you really want to sort of drive improvements, then I think the trust's got to take ownership of what happened and ownership of making things different to ensure that that situation can't help in the future. You know, Jan's story talked a lot about the importance to her and her family of being able to have that conversation with the consultant who knew Katie, who, you know, was involved with them from the beginning. I'm not sure whether that would have been quite the same if it had been some, you know, unknown person from NHS England that had been responsible for liaising with them. So I think in general, the trusts have got to step up and be responsible for investigating and engaging with families effectively themselves. And it's not really something that you can easily outsource to some other body.
Thank you. I think that the point you make around ownership of learning and is so important, that if it's done by somebody else, it's very difficult, often someone external, it's very difficult often for organisations to really own that learning. There's another question in the chat from Elena saying that sometimes one of the reasons that trusts clam up and don't give information is because their lawyers have advised them not to speak. And is there an issue around how we need to engage with NHS lawyers around how they advise? And certainly in my experience, I've seen NHS lawyers who don't always advise appropriately. I don't know if anyone wants to make a start on that. Len, you're a solicitor. Do you want to have a go on then, Jan?
Jan are probably best placed to take, because we always say the same thing. But if you ask the lawyer for a particular question, you'll get a particular answer. Yeah. So rather than ask, "How do I not share that?" if you ask them, "How do I share that?" you'll get a very different answer. And it's all about, for us, it's the same in anything that you're doing. When it comes to involving a lawyer, you'll get 20 different answers for the same question, depending on how it's phrased. So if you just ask them, "How can I share this information? What allows me to do that?" There's your starting and your finishing point. If you ask them, "How do I not share this information?" you'll get an information not share it. So it's really down to the leaders at the trust, how you ask the question, how it's phrased, and what you want out of it, because you'll always find a way to share or not to share depending on the question that you asked.
Thank you, Len. Very sensible advice. And Jan, you wanted to come in on this, I think.
As Len said, we generally say exactly the same things. I think, you know, if you go to your lawyer and say, "We want to be as open and transparent and share as much as we possibly can you help us to do that?" you will get a much different response.
Thank you. And Jan, you'd like to come in?
Yeah. It was just a comment based on attending the HSJ Congress recently, and Sir Robert Francis was there, who wrote the Francis Report, and I had a brief chat with him afterwards, and he was saying, if you get to the point where the lawyers are involved, you've failed, because it's inevitably an adversarial kind of process, and that actually what you need to be doing within trusts is to work very hard before that to prevent it ever being necessary to go to lawyers. And I thought that was a really interesting comment from a man who's, you know, a lawyer himself and who's been involved in such high profile cases, that he saw that as almost a failure, you know, to engage with families if it comes to that point.
Thank you, Jan. And you talked very much about the fact that the way that the surgeon responded to you and was so open and apologised and wanted to understand the impact for you, that restored your trust and confidence. And people often forget that. Dorrit, you were first, and then Len.
All right, go.
Sorry, Len. No, I was going to say, I think, because I heard Robert Francis say that, and it was very striking, but I think there's something that he missed there, which is that trusts have got their own in-house lawyers and family has got nobody. And so actually you do need to get some advice as a family on what are these processes? You've never faced any of it before. Just someone to explain it. I mean, this is where, you know, I felt that being able to ring AFMA, Action Against Medical Accidents, helped us, because they understood and they could say that it's this, 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 and this, and they put it all in writing for us so that we were not left trying to remember it. But I think it's really important to remember that that every NHS trust has got its own legal team. And it is how you ask the question. And that, again, is right back to organisational culture. So I've learned over many years of working in charities that you never ask a question in such a way as you might get an answer you don't like. And it's actually sometimes better not to ask the question. It also came up at the Patient Safety Congress about, well, how come you were allowed to go and meet someone, to one of the A&E consultants? Oh, there's someone at the door. Sorry, I'm ignoring him. How come you were allowed to go and meet? It was a family meeting. Why did I have to ask permission? It's the organisational culture.
Yes, thank you, Dorrit. And there are further comments in the chat about some of this discussion. I'm just going to come to you, Len, but there was just, when I was saying that, Len, you had somebody, senior as a senior investigator, there's can't remember, one of our contributors here, I can't remember, find her name, I'll find it in a minute, was saying that she did, that actually it was the chief nurse that was sort of overseeing the investigation and wasn't providing the answers. So it can be really difficult for people if you have got to the top of the organisation and the doors are still closed. And that's a real challenge for people. Where do you, and that then comes back, I think, to the points you're making, Dorrit, that the NHS has got all their own lawyers, and that's why people often need to find their lawyers. And but Len, you wanted to come in on this.
It was just to follow up on what Dorrit said in relation to that. I mean, when you go to an inquest, you've not only got lawyers, but you've got barristers as well from the trust, all paid for by me and you, by the taxpayer. And I think what is very sort of, it's even more of a kick in the teeth to the family, is that they can't get legal aid, or they can't afford to instruct solicitors, but our own taxpayers' money is being used on barristers, solicitors, and not just one, there might be 2, 3 or 4 for the NHS, and not just for the NHS, not just for the trust, but for the nurses, or for the psychiatrists, or for the doctors, for the overall NHS as well. So there might be 5 or 6 different solicitors, barristers for the trust, for the NHS, for the nurses, for everyone else, all paid for by us, and nothing for the family. And that's the same with not only for the inquest, but if you're going to bring an action or you're going to sue a trust, most of the time when it comes to looking at the numbers, life isn't expensive. It's not worth much in monetary terms, unless you're a sort of 21-year-old stockbroker with a young family who they can calculate that off. If you're elderly or retired, it's a very harsh and most people, you look at it and you think life isn't worth very much. And when it comes to the end of settling these cases, the only real people that get any expense or any money out of it isn't necessarily the families. It will be the lawyers for both sides potentially taking that money. And I just think that could be redistributed better elsewhere without the need to get to that stage.
Absolutely. I think those are very well said. And it does seem that some trusts are much more ready to jump to their legal teams rather than to try and work in partnership. But I'm going to just pose another question, which I think Richard has raised in the chat and Jan referred to. As Richard asked whether PSERF, Jan talked about the new approach that the NHS is moving to, the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework. And Jan, you talked particularly about the engagement model there. And Richard has asked whether you think that PSERF will make a difference and will help change some of this defensive culture and will help, address some of the barriers that Jan raised. I don't know if, Jan Sunman, do you want to start? And then I'll perhaps come over to Jan Fowler.
I think it's fair to say that certainly from a family perspective, the jury's still out about whether PSERF will actually make a difference or not. I think what concerns me is, again, it's back to leadership in the organisations. If you've got an organisation that wants to be transparent and open and to learn, they will be very supportive of using PSERF in a really flexible way and involving families really well. My worry is the risk that there is an under investigation of incidents, because they could decide, you know, it's either gets absorbed into a thematic review, so individual families' concerns are not necessarily met, but also there's a risk that some trusts who may have something to hide based on our past experiences with some of the trusts that we know, there could be a genuine risk of under investigation, and that was highlighted in the Mazars report, for example, following the deaths of young people and elderly people in Southern Health particularly, where it was very clearly identified that there was an under investigation for specific groups of patients in that particular trust. So I think my feeling is the jury's still out. Let's see how well it works. I don't know whether I'm being overcautious. Maybe Dorrit and Len may take a different view, but that's my feeling about it.
I think you're probably absolutely right. And just to say for people listening that particularly at Southern Health, I was very struck around the death of Connor Sparrowhawk, who was a young man with learning disabilities and autism, and whose mother campaigned hugely to get answers around what happened. And he he had a fit and drowned in the bath, and the trust at the time didn't think that that was a death that needed investigating. So the points you're making around culture, and that actually you can have whatever system or approach you want, if the culture isn't right in the organisation and people don't see what they need to be doing and the opportunities for learning. So I'm being told that we've got 3 minutes left. So I'm going to turn to Jan. Did you want to make a comment about PSEF? And then I'll see if Len or Dorrit want to.
Just that PSEF is guidance. Serious incident framework that went before was guidance. Some trusts use the serious incident framework well and were open and involved families. Some of them didn't. And I think at the moment, yes, the jury is still out because actually PSEF is only still being rolled out across the NHS. There are a few early adopters, but most of the organisations are still rolling that out. And I'm not sure that changes anything in the sense, if you want to do it really well, you could do it with the old guidance. If you don't want to do it well, I'm not sure there's too much in PSEF that is going to make that tangible difference. Can I just make one other comment, just in response to something that Richard put in the chat, which is absolutely, he talked about the HSIB, which is the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch, which is a national organisation. And although, yes, that exists, but there are limitations around it, just in case people don't know what that is or how it can be helpful, because that, it doesn't investigate anything prior to, I think, 2017, something like that, when it was first sort of set up. But also it's very limited in the capacity that it can investigate. So it's got a big chunk of work around maternity investigations for obvious reasons. But there's not a lot left then for other types. Whilst it encourages people to log issues, so that obviously they're building some database where they can sort of see the sort of trends of things that are coming through, it's not the answer. And I think still that the response should be actually trusts have got to take ownership of these investigations.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for picking that up. Now I've got 1 minute left. Dorrit and Len, did you want to make a further comment?
Well, just to add really, in terms of guidance. So there is mountains of guidance from government, professional bodies, NICE, that say that you must take corroborative evidence as part of doing a Mental Health Act assessment from a carer. It's not negligent not to. Guidance is routinely not followed, even when it's dangerous not to. So, if trusts want to do something well, they will. If they don't, the guidance won't make any difference. Over many years, I've grown really tired of people saying what we need is new guidance. No, we don't. We need better leaders.
I would absolutely agree with you. And I can tell you that in my time, over the years, I've grown absolutely tired of reading a serious incident investigation report that says the learning is going to be, we're going to either amend or write a new policy or provide some additional training. Nothing that's really going to make a difference and make a change. Now, I'm going to draw this to a close because it's now 2 o'clock. But really just to say thank you so much to Making Families Count. This has been just fabulous presentation from you all, and thank you for sharing such personal stories, and thank you for the discussion and the debate. We could go on because it's such an important issue, but really so much to learn and to take forward for organisations that aren't able to do this well. Now, I also want to thank all of our participants, because in the Q&A, several people have shared their own personal stories. And I'm sorry we haven't been able to, to talk about those in more detail, but thank you so much. And then Kevin is asking whether there'll be a recording available, and it will be, the recording of this webinar will be available later today on our website. So please keep an eye out and look at that. And one final remark is that Richard also mentioned the work that the Harmed Patients Alliance, together with AVMA, are trying to take forward around independent advocacy and support for people. That's another area to watch for, and they have recently produced a report around that. Richard is thanking everybody and saying he wished there would be more progress. So there are a number of different organisations trying to make a difference here. So lots to take forward, I think, and for us to think about how we can really make some of this become a reality. But for now, thank you all, and the recordings will be available.